Hey guys, tonight we are going to step back, way back, to a time of longships, sagas, and surprisingly, very plain food. Imagine yourself in a drafty longhouse, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke filling the air, and the distant bleating of sheep as the only lullaby. You're bundled in rough wool, perhaps a bit scratchy, and the fire in the center of the hall casts dancing shadows on the timbered walls. It's cold, often damp, and the promise of a delicious, varied meal isn't exactly a guarantee. In fact, if you were relying on Viking cuisine for your daily sustenance, you probably wouldn't survive past, say, Tuesday. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, post your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the cold, damp ground, the wind whipping through your hair, and the distinct scent of a wood fire clinging to your clothes. This isn't a 5-star culinary tour, this is the reality of a Viking Age settlement, and your stomach, accustomed to modern conveniences, might be rumbling with a touch of apprehension. Tonight, we are going to unravel the surprising, often monotonous, truth about what kept those formidable figures fed. Forget the grand feasting halls depicted in sagas, those were rare, often ceremonial occasions. For the most part, the Viking diet was one of necessity, ingenuity, and a good deal of repetition. And at its very core, providing the fundamental energy for everything from farming to raiding, were grains. You see fields stretching out, not neat rows of corn or wheat, but hardy patches of barley and rye, waving in the stiff breeze. These weren't luxury crops, they were the absolute backbone of survival. Barley, in particular, was the workhorse of the Viking grain world. It grew well in the northern climates, maturing relatively quickly, and providing a decent yield even in less than ideal soil. You can almost feel the rough texture of the grains as you imagine them being ground, perhaps with a quern stone, the rhythmic thud scrape echoing through the simple dwelling. This wasn't a fine, delicate flour you'd use for a soufflé. No, this was coarse, whole-grain stuff, retaining much of the bran and germ, which, while excellent for nutrition, probably made for some pretty dense and challenging baked goods. Think of it less as artisanal sourdough, and more as something akin to a particularly sturdy, no-nonsense flatbread. This unleavened bread, often cooked directly on hot stones or in the ashes of the fire, would have been a daily staple, accompanying almost every meal. You tear off a piece, perhaps still warm, and it's chewy, earthy, and frankly, a bit bland. But it fills you up, and that's the main goal. Rye was another key player, especially in the more northern parts of Scandinavia. You observe the tall, slender stalks of rye, swaying in the wind, a more robust and cold-tolerant grain than wheat. Rye, like barley, made a hearty bread, often denser and darker, contributing to the famous Scandinavian dark bread traditions that persist to this day. Imagine the faint, slightly sour tang of rye bread, a taste that would become deeply ingrained in the palates of generations. It wasn't just bread, though. Grains were also central to porridges and stews. You picture a large cauldron hanging over the fire, simmering slowly, filled with water, perhaps some dried meat, and a generous quantity of barley or rye groats. This would be a gruel, thick and sustaining, eaten with a wooden spoon, a common breakfast or evening meal. It's warm, comforting in its simplicity, and designed purely for caloric intake rather than culinary delight. The process of preparing these grains was labor-intensive. You envision hands calloused from harvesting with sickles, then threshing the grain, separating the kernels from the stalks, a dusty, repetitive task. Then came the grinding, a slow, grinding process, often done by hand using those quern stones, a top stone rotating over a stationary base. You can hear the low, grating sound, imagine the effort involved, the muscles in your arms aching. It was a daily chore, performed by women and, at times, children, a constant reminder of the effort required simply to put food on the table. This wasn't just about cooking, It was about transforming raw nature into sustenance, a skill that required strength, endurance, and practical knowledge. Beyond the daily bread and gruel, historians still argue whether wheat was a common crop. It certainly existed, and archaeological finds confirm its presence, but it seems to have been less prevalent than barley and rye, likely reserved for more specific uses, or regions where the climate was more forgiving. Perhaps for a finer loaf on a special occasion, or if you were particularly affluent. You probably wouldn't see vast wheat fields stretching to the horizon like you might in warmer climes. Instead, you'd be seeing the familiar, sturdy grains, resilient against the often harsh Nordic weather. This emphasis on hardy grains speaks volumes about the pragmatic approach to food in the Viking Age. It wasn't about gourmet, it was about getting enough, about survival through the long, dark winters. The simplicity of their grain-based diet might seem monotonous to your modern palate, but it was effective, providing the essential foundation for their lives. And as you consider this foundational diet, you begin to understand that even the most formidable warriors and explorers relied on something as humble as a bowl of gruel to fuel their epic journeys. As the lingering taste of humble grain bread fades from your imagination, a new aroma begins to drift through the longhouse, a slightly sour, tangy scent that speaks of preservation and resourcefulness. You see bowls and churns, not filled with fresh, frothy milk, but with its transformed descendants, skyr, butter, and various forms of cheese. For the Vikings, fresh milk was a fleeting luxury, limited to the warm months and the immediate vicinity of their livestock. The true backbone of their dairy consumption lay in its fermented forms, a testament to their mastery of food preservation and an absolute necessity for survival through the long, harsh winters. You watch as a Viking woman vigorously churns milk in a wooden barrel, the rhythmic thump swish a familiar sound in any settlement. This isn't just about making butter for spreading on bread, it's about extracting every ounce of caloric value and extending the shelf life of a precious resource. Butter, with its high fat content, was a valuable commodity, providing energy and flavor. It could be stored for months, even buried for long-term preservation, becoming firmer and more pungent over time. Imagine taking a bite of this butter. It wouldn't be the delicate, sweet creamery butter you're used to. It would be dense, perhaps a little salty, and certainly possessing a more pronounced, almost nutty flavor, a direct result of its fermentation and storage. But perhaps even more ubiquitous were the various forms of soured milk and cheese. You might encounter skyr, a thick, yogurt-like product that is still a staple in Iceland today. It's made by curdling skimmed milk with a starter culture, then straining off the whey. You picture scooping a spoonful of skyr. It's probably tart, creamy, and incredibly filling, packed with protein, a true nutritional powerhouse. It would have been eaten plain, or perhaps with a handful of foraged berries if you were lucky enough to have them. This wasn't just a snack, it was a substantial part of a meal, providing vital nutrients in a digestible form. The fermentation process not only preserved the milk, but also made it more palatable for those who might otherwise struggle with lactose, a common issue for many historical populations. Then there were the cheeses, ranging from fresh, soft curds to harder, aged varieties. You can almost feel the crumbly texture of a simple curd cheese, perhaps pressed from sheep or goat milk. These cheeses were less about sophisticated flavors and more about extending the life of milk into a solid, transportable form. They weren't making brie or cheddar as you know them. Instead, think of a firmer, perhaps saltier cottage cheese, or a dry, hard cheese that could be grated or gnawed on. Historians still argue whether some of their harder cheeses were similar to modern-day Parmesan in terms of their long aging and robust flavor profile, but one thing is certain, they were designed for longevity and sustenance. You can imagine a piece of hard cheese, tucked into a traveler's pouch, providing slow-release energy on a long journey, far from any fresh milk source. The whey, the liquid byproduct of cheese and skyr production, wasn't wasted either. You might see it used in bread making, adding a tangy note and moisture, or even consumed as a beverage, providing residual nutrients and hydration. Nothing was discarded in this frugal, survival-oriented economy. Every part of the milk, from the rich cream for butter to the watery whey, found its purpose. This commitment to utilizing every resource highlights the pragmatic nature of Viking life. You realize that their relationship with food was one of deep respect for its ability to sustain life, not merely to satisfy cravings. The entire process of dairy production, from milking to churning to curdling, was intensely seasonal. You visualize the cows and goats grazing in the summer pastures, their udders full, leading to a flurry of activity as families worked to process the milk into storable forms before the colder months set in. It was a race against time, a period of intense labor to ensure adequate provisions for winter, when fresh supplies would dwindle to almost nothing. This rhythmic cycle of abundance and scarcity dictated much of Viking daily life and their dietary habits. The ingenuity required to transform perishable milk into a winter larder of butter, skyr, and cheese is truly remarkable. It tells a story of adaptation, of living in harmony with the natural rhythms of their environment, and of a profound understanding of the biochemistry of food preservation. You realize that behind every Viking warrior and explorer was a household dedicated to the careful, laborious process of turning milk into sustenance, ensuring that the community had enough to eat long after the last cow had been milked dry for the season. Having explored the foundational grains and the ingenious dairy products, your mental journey through the Viking kitchen now brings you to the crucial world of protein. When you think Viking, your mind probably conjures images of fierce warriors wielding axes, perhaps fresh from a successful raid. And while raiding certainly brought spoils, including food, the everyday reality of obtaining meat and fish was far more grounded in domestic life and local resources. Forget the idea that every Viking was constantly feasting on roasted boar. Most of their protein came from much humbler, but equally vital, sources. You can almost smell the faint scent of preserved fish hanging in the air, a constant companion in coastal settlements. The seas and rivers were an absolute lifeline. Fishing was not just a pastime, it was a primary occupation for many, providing a steady and often abundant source of protein. Cod, herring, mackerel, and salmon were caught in huge numbers. Imagine nets being cast, lines being pulled in, the silver flash of scales in the cold Nordic light. This fish wasn't necessarily eaten fresh daily, especially in inland areas or during off-seasons. No, preservation was key. You'd see fish split open and laid out on wooden racks to dry in the sun and wind, becoming stockfish, hard, light, and incredibly shelf-stable. Or perhaps it would be salted, packed into barrels, a process that transformed its texture and flavor, but ensured its longevity. Eating stockfish isn't a gourmet experience, it's tough, requiring a good deal of chewing, and often soaked before cooking. But it provided essential protein and fat, especially during the long winters when other food sources were scarce. You might gnaw on a piece of dried cod, feeling its leathery texture, tasting the concentrated salt and fishiness, and understanding that this simple food was a cornerstone of survival. Beyond the aquatic bounty, terrestrial animals also played a significant role, though perhaps less glamorous than you might imagine. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were all kept. You hear the lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, sounds that would have been a constant backdrop to Viking life. These animals weren't just for meat, they provided milk, wool, hides, and labor. When an animal was slaughtered, no part went to waste. Every scrap of meat, every organ, even the blood, would be utilized. You might see blood sausages being made, or guts cleaned and prepared, reflecting a deeply ingrained practicality born of necessity. This wasn't a culture that could afford to be squeamish. Hunting wild game was also practiced, but likely supplemented, rather than formed the core of their diet. You imagine tracking a deer through a snow-covered forest, or setting snares for smaller birds. Depending on the region, this could include deer, elk, wild boar, birds, and even seals or whales in coastal areas. While a successful hunt would provide a welcome bounty of fresh meat, it was unpredictable and often dangerous. It's important to remember that these were not industrial-scale farming operations or sport hunting expeditions. Every animal represented a significant investment of time, effort, and risk. Historians still argue whether large-scale communal hunts for specific animals, like whales, were common practice or rare events in different Viking regions. Evidence suggests a mix of individual and collective efforts, reflecting the varied resources available across their vast territories. Regardless, the meat, whether from domesticated animals or wild game, would often be preserved through smoking or salting to extend its shelf life. Imagine strips of meat hanging in the smokehouse, absorbing the rich, woody scent that would become part of its flavor and preservation. This smoked meat, often tough and intensely flavored, would be added to stews or eaten in thin slices. You might be surprised by the relative scarcity of meat in the everyday diet for many common Vikings. While the sagas often speak of lavish feasts, for the majority of the population, meat was likely consumed less frequently than fish, and certainly less than grains and dairy. It was a valuable resource, cherished and carefully managed. The image of a Viking warrior constantly gorging on roasted meats is more fantasy than fact. Instead, picture meals where small portions of dried fish or a few pieces of salted meat were stretched to provide flavor and protein for a larger dish primarily composed of grains and vegetables. The emphasis was on sustenance, on making every calorie count. This careful rationing and resourceful utilization of every animal part underscores the harsh realities of their environment and the constant effort required to maintain a healthy and viable food supply. From the steady provision of fish and the managed scarcity of meat, your journey through the Viking pantry now leads you away from the confines of the longhouse and into the wild, untamed landscapes surrounding it. Here, the subtle art of foraging and wild edibles played a crucial, often overlooked, role in diversifying a diet that could otherwise be quite monotonous. You're no longer just reliant on what you can farm or herd. Now, you're learning to read the land, to understand its seasonal offerings, and to find hidden sustenance in unexpected places. Imagine walking through a dense forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Your eyes are trained to spot small details, to identify edible plants amidst a sea of green. Berries were a gift from the northern summer, a burst of sweetness and vital vitamins after the long, dark winter. You might see wild blueberries, tart cloudberries, or plump lingonberries, painting the undergrowth in vibrant hues. These weren't just for immediate consumption, they were diligently gathered, often dried or preserved in honey if available, to provide a much-needed source of sweetness and nutrition through the colder months. You reach out, imagining popping a handful of tart wild cranberries into your mouth, feeling the burst of flavor a rare treat. This was a seasonal bounty, eagerly anticipated and meticulously harvested. Beyond berries, a surprising array of wild plants would have contributed to the Viking diet. Think of things we today might consider weeds or garden herbs. Nettles, for example, were highly nutritious, packed with vitamins and minerals. You picture hands, perhaps gloved or protected, carefully plucking young nettle leaves, destined to be boiled down into a simple, earthy soup or added to stews. Dandelions, sorrel, and wild mustard greens also provided leafy greens, adding a bitter or tangy note to meals that might otherwise lack fresh vegetables. These weren't cultivated gardens, but rather a profound understanding of the natural world and what it could offer. You realize that a Viking's foraging knowledge was akin to a modern-day botanist's expertise, honed over generations of trial and error. Mushrooms, too, would have been collected, though this comes with an inherent risk. You imagine carefully identifying edible fungi, a skill passed down from elder to child, knowing that a mistake could be deadly. The earthy, umami flavor of wild mushrooms would have been a welcome addition to a stew, adding depth and richness. But this required keen observational skills and an intimate knowledge of the local flora. Historians still argue whether certain hallucinogenic mushrooms were intentionally consumed for ritualistic purposes, or if their consumption was purely accidental, but the majority of mushroom gathering would have been for straightforward sustenance. Seaweed, particularly for those living along the coast, offered another accessible and nutritious resource. You envision gathering various types of seaweed from the rocky shores, perhaps dulse or kelp, to be dried and added to dishes, providing minerals and a unique salty, oceanic flavor. This isn't just about survival, it's about making the most of every available resource, a testament to their deep connection with their environment. Even birch sap, collected in the spring, would have provided a slightly sweet, refreshing drink, a sign of the earth waking up after winter's slumber. You picture a small spile tapped into a birch tree, slowly dripping clear, cool sap into a waiting container. This wasn't a primary food source, but a welcome seasonal supplement. The knowledge of these subtle natural rhythms and bounties was essential for daily life. It wasn't about mass production, but about sustainable harvesting and living off the land in a way that modern society has largely forgotten. You're learning to see the landscape not just as scenery, but as a living larder, filled with provisions for those who knew how to find them. The quiet satisfaction of finding a patch of ripe berries or a cluster of edible greens would have been a small, but significant victory in the daily quest for sustenance. From the subtle bounty of wild edibles, your attention now turns to a crucial, often life-saving, aspect of Viking subsistence, the preservation arts. In a world without refrigeration or modern canning, the ability to store food for months, even years, was not just a convenience, it was the difference between survival and starvation, especially through the long, dark, lean winters. You observe the ingenious methods they employed, recognizing that every technique was born of necessity and perfected over generations. You see vast quantities of fish, not just fresh from the sea, but laid out on immense wooden racks, exposed to the ceaseless, cold Nordic winds. This is drying, perhaps the most fundamental and widespread preservation method. You can almost feel the dry, crisp texture of the stockfish, often cod or other whitefish, becoming rigid as it loses all its moisture. This wasn't a quick process, it took weeks, sometimes months, but the result was a lightweight, highly nutritious, and incredibly durable food source. Imagine biting into a piece of dried fish. It's tough, requiring considerable chewing, and its flavor is intensely concentrated, a testament to the slow evaporation of water. This stockfish could be stored indefinitely, providing essential protein when other food sources dwindled. Next, your nose catches the pungent, salty tang of salting. You picture barrels brimming with fish, layers of salt meticulously packed between the fillets. Or perhaps meat, cut into strips, rubbed liberally with salt, and then hung to dry or cured in brine. Salt was a precious commodity, not always easy to obtain, but its power to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth was invaluable. You can almost taste the intense salinity of these cured meats and fish, a stark contrast to fresh produce. This was a crucial method for preserving the richer, fattier fish like herring, which didn't dry as well. Think of it as the ultimate natural charcuterie, designed for longevity, not fleeting gourmet appeal. The pervasive scent of wood smoke now fills your senses, leading you to the smokehouse. Here, meat and fish hang from the rafters, slowly imbued with the preserving and flavoring properties of smoke from smoldering wood. You see sides of beef, perhaps a leg of lamb, or entire fish, gently smoking for days or even weeks. This process not only preserved the food, but also added a distinctive, deep flavor. Imagine a piece of smoked salmon or reindeer meat, its texture firm, its taste rich and earthy, a true delicacy born of practical necessity. Smoking was particularly effective for preserving fattier cuts of meat and fish, adding another layer of protection against spoilage. Fermentation, which you encountered with dairy, was also applied to other food types. While less common for meat than drying or salting, some evidence suggests fermented fish products existed, similar to modern Scandinavian surströmming. You might even observe some rudimentary form of pickling with certain vegetables, using sour liquids or brines, though this was less prevalent than for fish or meat. The idea was to create an acidic environment that bacteria couldn't thrive in, turning potential spoilage into a unique, tangy flavor. Beyond these primary methods, cold storage played a role, especially in the northern reaches. You can imagine pits dug into the frozen ground, or food stored in unheated outbuildings, relying on the natural chill to slow spoilage. In the deepest winter, the very air acted as a giant freezer. And while not a preservation method in itself, the careful use of animal fats, as a protective seal for cooked meats or berries, effectively confit style, would have helped extend their freshness for a short period. Historians still argue whether some form of rudimentary burial for food, taking advantage of cool, stable ground temperatures, was more widespread than currently believed. The ingenuity of these Viking preservation techniques is truly remarkable. They utilized the natural elements wind, sun, salt, smoke, and cold to transform perishable goods into enduring sustenance. Every dried fish, every salted joint of meat, every smoked strip of venison, represented a victory against scarcity, a carefully managed resource that ensured survival through the leanest times. You realize that a Viking kitchen wasn't just a place of cooking, it was a sophisticated, if unwritten, laboratory of food science, where the very act of preserving food was an art form honed by generations of necessity. With the crucial act of preservation understood, your imagination now brings you right into the heart of a Viking dwelling, to the center of daily life, the hearth. Here, all those carefully stored ingredients, along with whatever fresh produce was available, would come together through simple, yet effective, cooking methods. Forget elaborate ovens or complicated cooktops. Viking cooking was primarily about direct heat, patience, and making the most of a single, central fire. You crouch by the flickering flames of the central hearth, the heart of any longhouse. This isn't just for warmth, it's the kitchen itself. Above it hangs a sturdy metal, or sometimes ceramic cauldron, perpetually simmering. Boiling was arguably the most common cooking method. You can almost see bits of salted meat, dried fish, root vegetables, if available, and those ever-present grains bubbling away in a communal stew or porridge. This was the ultimate one-pot meal, efficient and nourishing, slowly releasing its aromas into the smoky air. These stews weren't designed for quick consumption, they were often left to simmer for hours, even days, constantly replenished as needed, a continuous source of warmth and sustenance. The long simmering times would have tenderized tough cuts of meat and made fibrous vegetables more digestible. Next to the fire, you might see flat stones heating up. This was for baking bread, but not the airy loaves you are familiar with. Imagine unleavened flatbreads, made from coarse barley or rye flour, slapped onto the hot stones or directly into the ashes. You hear the faint sizzle as the dough meets the heat, and smell the earthy scent of toasting grain. These flatbreads would be thin, sturdy, and quickly cooked, perfect for a grab-and-go meal or for scooping up stew. This method was practical, requiring minimal equipment beyond the fire itself. While not as common for large cuts, roasting and grilling would certainly occur, particularly for special occasions or when fresh meat was available. You picture a whole fish or a smaller animal, perhaps a rabbit or a bird, skewed on a spit and slowly turned over the open flames, the fat dripping and sizzling into the embers below. The smell of roasting meat, though probably rare, would have been a truly mouth-watering experience. This was more of a celebratory meal, a moment to savor the freshness of the catch or hunt. You might also observe food being cooked directly in the embers or wrapped in leaves and cooked in hot ash. Think of root vegetables, like wild parsnips or carrots, nestled directly into the coals, slowly softening and developing a smoky sweetness. This ash baking is a simple, effective method that requires no pots or pans, relying solely on the heat of the fire. The simplicity of these cooking methods reflects the practical demands of Viking life. There was no need for complex culinary techniques when survival was the primary goal. Every tool, every process, was designed for efficiency and to maximize the caloric intake from available resources. You might see rudimentary iron griddles or pans, but the cauldron and the hot stones were the workhorses of the Viking kitchen. Historians still argue whether Vikings used primitive forms of an earth oven for larger-scale cooking, where heated stones in a pit would slow-cook wrapped food, but it's clear that direct fire contact was paramount. The focus was always on utility, how to cook food thoroughly, safely, and with minimal fuss. The resulting meals, while perhaps bland by modern standards, were deeply nourishing and perfectly suited to the active, demanding lives of the Viking people. You realize that the crackle of the hearth, the gentle steam from the cauldron, and the humble scent of baking flatbread were the everyday sensory symphony of a Viking home, promising warmth and sustenance. Having warmed yourself by the hearth and sampled the simple boiled and baked fare, your journey into the Viking diet now turns to what they drank. Forget sugary sodas or fancy cocktails. The beverages of the Viking age were, like their food, primarily functional, though they certainly knew how to enjoy themselves when the opportunity arose. Water, of course, was fundamental, but beyond that, the most common fermented drinks played a crucial role in daily life and celebration. You hear the bubbling sound, and a slightly yeasty, malty scent wafts through the air. This is the aroma of ale, arguably the most common alcoholic beverage. Made from grains like barley or oats, ale was less potent than modern beers, more akin to a nourishing, cloudy gruel with a mild alcoholic kick. You picture it being brewed regularly in homes, often by the women of the household, a continuous process ensuring a steady supply. It wasn't just for pleasure. Ale provided calories, some nutrients, and was often safer to drink than untreated water, as the brewing process killed off many harmful pathogens. Imagine taking a sip that's thick, earthy, perhaps a little sweet, and certainly not clear. It's a drink that sustained, hydrated, and, in larger quantities, brought a gentle warmth and relaxation after a long day of labor. Then there's the more esteemed, sweeter cousin of ale, mead. You might associate mead with grand feasts and heroic sagas, and you'd be right. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was a more luxurious drink, its production dependent on the availability of honey, a valuable and somewhat scarce resource. You envision a golden liquid, perhaps slightly cloudy, poured into a horn or wooden cup. The taste would be sweet, complex, with a distinct honey flavor, and generally possessing a higher alcohol content than everyday ale. Mead wasn't an everyday beverage. It was reserved for celebrations, important gatherings, and as a mark of status. Imagine clinking a drinking horn with fellow Vikings, the mead flowing, a symbol of camaraderie and prosperity. This was the drink of poets and chieftains, celebrated in verses and enjoyed during moments of communal joy. While ale and mead dominate the popular imagination, other fermented drinks might have existed. Historians still argue whether various fruit wines, made from foraged berries, were a regular part of the Viking drinking repertoire, but their sporadic nature would have limited their widespread production compared to grain-based ales. It's plausible that regional variations and seasonal availability led to experimental ferments from time to time. Of course, water was always available, drawn from wells, springs, and rivers. But in an era without advanced sanitation, relying solely on unboiled water could be risky. So, while you'd certainly drink water, especially when working hard, the fermented alternatives offered a safer and more calorically beneficial option. The act of making ale or mead was deeply ingrained in the domestic rhythm, a craft passed down through generations. It wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about transforming raw ingredients into a stable, consumable liquid that played a fundamental role in both sustenance and social cohesion. The hum of conversation, the warmth of the fire, and the steady flow of ale, or the occasional mead would have created a convivial atmosphere, a temporary respite from the demanding realities of Viking life. As the gentle buzz of imagined ale fades, a more sobering reality of Viking life comes into focus, the stark contrast between feasting and famine. While sagas often paint pictures of bountiful tables laden with food, the truth for most Vikings was a cyclical existence dictated by the seasons, where periods of relative plenty were often followed by prolonged stretches of scarcity. You learn that survival often hinged on careful planning during times of abundance and extreme resilience during periods of dearth. You stand in the middle of a bustling summer market, the air alive with the sounds of trade and the smells of freshly caught fish and ripening berries. This is a time of relative abundance. The fields yield their grains, the animals graze on lush pastures, and the forests and waters offer their wild bounties. This is when the longhouses are filled with activity: harvesting, drying fish, salting meat, brewing ale, and making cheese. Every able body is involved in the meticulous process of preserving food, of stockpiling for the inevitable lean times ahead. You see families working tirelessly, knowing that their efforts now will determine their survival through the colder months. These moments of plenty were not for indulgence, but for strategic preparation. But then, the days shorten, the temperatures drop, and the landscape becomes stark and unforgiving. This is when the specter of famine looms large. The ground freezes, making foraging impossible. Fishing becomes dangerous, and hunting yields less. The livestock, if not slaughtered for meat, must be fed from dwindling hay stores. You picture the gnawing anxiety that would accompany the decreasing provisions, the careful rationing of every last dried fish and piece of stockfish. Meals would become smaller, simpler, often consisting of little more than thin gruel made from the last of the stored grains. This wasn't just a matter of going hungry for a day. Prolonged periods of food scarcity could lead to malnutrition, weakness, and increased susceptibility to illness. The ability to forecast and prepare for these lean times was a hallmark of successful Viking communities. Those who failed to preserve enough, or whose harvests were poor due to bad weather or disease, would face severe hardship. You can almost feel the chill of an empty stomach, the dull ache that permeates your bones when food is truly scarce. This was the raw, unvarnished reality for many, a constant struggle against the elements to secure enough sustenance. Historians still argue whether the concept of a true famine, in the sense of mass starvation, was frequent or relatively rare, often mitigated by localized trade and raiding. However, periods of food stress, where diets were drastically reduced in quantity and variety, were undoubtedly common. You might hear whispers of communities sharing dwindling resources, or individuals venturing further afield in desperate search of food, highlighting the community aspect of survival and the stark consequences of individual failure. The transition between feasting and famine wasn't always a sharp, dramatic break. It was often a gradual tapering off of resources, a slow tightening of belts as winter deepened. The knowledge that winter provisions were slowly dwindling would have cast a long shadow over daily life. The ability to endure these periods of scarcity, to make every morsel count, and to remain resilient in the face of hunger speaks volumes about the stoic nature of the Viking people. You realize that the grand feasts depicted in sagas were truly extraordinary events, moments of genuine celebration that stood in stark contrast to the everyday reality of a diet defined by cyclical scarcity and the constant, quiet struggle against hunger. As the stark reality of seasonal scarcity settles in, your perspective widens, and you begin to appreciate that the Viking diet wasn't a monolithic entity. Instead, it was a tapestry woven with threads of local resources and climatic conditions, leading to significant regional dietary variations. What sustained a family in the icy fjords of Norway might have been quite different from the provisions available in the fertile lands of Denmark or the distant settlements in Greenland. You envision yourself standing on the rugged, Norwegian coastline, where towering mountains plunge into deep fjords. Here, the sea is an omnipresent provider. Fish, particularly cod and herring, would have dominated the diet. You can almost smell the pungent saltiness of stockfish drying on countless racks, a primary source of protein and a staple trade good. Seals and even small whales would have supplemented their diet, providing not just meat, but also valuable blubber for fat and fuel. Agriculture was challenging in these steep, rocky terrains, so while some hardy grains might have been grown, foraging for berries and wild plants would have been crucial. The diet here was inextricably linked to the ocean's bounty. Now, transport yourself to the more fertile, rolling hills of Denmark or southern Sweden. The landscape is gentler, more conducive to agriculture. Here, you'd see more evidence of cultivated fields, with barley and rye playing an even more central role. You picture larger herds of cattle and pigs, indicating a greater reliance on animal husbandry for meat and dairy. While fish was still important, especially near the coasts, it might have been less dominant than in Norway. The possibility of cultivating a wider variety of vegetables and the presence of more diverse livestock would have offered a somewhat broader, though still limited, dietary range. Next, you arrive in the distant, icy reaches of Greenland, a truly challenging environment for sustained settlement. Life here was a constant battle against the cold and scarcity. You observe the ingenious reliance on marine mammals, seals, walruses, and even whales for both food and blubber. Their thick blubber provided essential fats and calories, crucial for surviving the extreme cold. Fish, particularly Arctic char, was also vital. Agriculture was incredibly difficult, limited to hardy grains and a few root vegetables in sheltered areas during short summers. Foraging was minimal, relying on a few hardy berries and scarce vegetation. The diet was harsh, specialized, and utterly dependent on mastering the hunt in an unforgiving landscape. On the other hand, consider the Viking settlements in the British Isles, like Dublin or York. While still Viking, their diet would have been influenced by the existing local populations and their agricultural practices. You might see more evidence of wheat cultivation and a broader array of domesticated animals already established in these richer farming regions. The blending of Norse traditions with local foodways would have created a somewhat more diverse diet than in the heartlands of Scandinavia. Historians still argue whether the dietary adaptations in these far-flung settlements, particularly Greenland, ultimately contributed to their success or eventual decline, given the fragile ecological balance. What's clear is that the Vikings were incredibly adaptable, tailoring their food production and consumption to the specific resources and challenges of each environment they inhabited. This wasn't a single culinary tradition, but a spectrum of survival strategies, each reflecting a deep understanding of their immediate surroundings. You realize that to truly understand the Viking diet, you must understand the subtle, yet profound, differences that geography imposed on their daily meals, from the fish-rich fjords to the grain-filled plains and the icy, seal-dependent outposts. From the regional variations in their sustenance, your imaginary voyage now touches upon a surprisingly potent, albeit limited, influence on the Viking diet, trade and exotic ingredients. While self-sufficiency was paramount, and most food came from local production, the vast network of Viking trade routes occasionally brought surprising flavors and valuable commodities back to Scandinavia, hinting at a world beyond their immediate shores. You picture a bustling market in a thriving Viking-age town like Hedeby or Birka. The air is filled with the scent of pine tar, wood smoke, and a hint of something unfamiliar, something distinctly foreign. While the bulk of trade involved furs, timber, iron, and slaves, food items, particularly luxury goods, or those with preservative qualities, sometimes made their way north. One of the most valuable imported food items, and certainly the most impactful for preservation, was salt. You imagine a trader carefully guarding sacks of precious, white crystals. While some salt could be produced locally through evaporation or burning seaweed, large quantities for widespread preservation often came from warmer, more saline sources, particularly from the continent. The availability of imported salt directly impacted the ability to cure vast amounts of fish and meat, extending the life of provisions and making long voyages possible. This wasn't just a spice, it was a fundamental tool of survival, obtained through intricate trade networks. Then there are the more truly exotic items, appearing perhaps as novelties rather than staples. Spices, for instance, would have been exceedingly rare and incredibly expensive. You might envision a merchant displaying a tiny pinch of peppercorns or a fragment of cinnamon bark, brought from distant lands along the Silk Road or via Byzantine trade routes. These weren't for everyday cooking, but for very special occasions, perhaps to mask the taste of rancid meat, though Vikings tried to avoid that, or as a display of immense wealth. Imagine just a hint of black pepper in a special celebratory stew, a flavor sensation that would have been utterly alien and luxurious to most. Historians still argue whether the presence of such exotic spices indicates a widespread culinary interest or merely opportunistic trade in high-value, easily transported goods. You also consider the subtle influence of wine. While ale and mead were the staple alcoholic beverages, archaeological finds and historical texts suggest that wine, particularly from Frankish or Rhenish vineyards, occasionally reached Viking shores. You might see a ceramic amphora, carefully transported, holding a dark, possibly strong, red wine. This, like spices, would have been a high-status drink, enjoyed by chieftains and the wealthy elite, a symbol of connection to the more sophisticated cultures of continental Europe. It would be a far cry from the cloudy, hearty ale, offering a different kind of alcoholic experience. Even certain nuts and dried fruits, not native to Scandinavia, might have appeared in small quantities through trade. Walnuts, almonds, or dried apricots, brought from southern Europe or even further east, would have been valuable sources of energy and sweetness, though again, they were a rarity. You picture a small handful of dried figs, a chewy, intensely sweet treat, a testament to the vast distances covered by their trade routes. These imported items, while not forming the backbone of the Viking diet, illustrate the interconnectedness of the Viking world. They remind you that despite their image of rugged self-sufficiency, Vikings were also participants in a broader European and even global economy. The arrival of a new spice, a barrel of foreign wine, or a bag of precious salt wasn't just a transaction, it was a fleeting glimpse into distant lands, a small but significant diversification of a diet that was otherwise profoundly local and practical. From the intriguing, if rare, presence of exotic trade goods, your journey now shifts to a more tender, yet equally pragmatic, aspect of Viking life, the diets of children and the process of weaning. In a society where survival was paramount, feeding the youngest members of the community was a delicate balance of traditional wisdom, available resources, and the slow adaptation from mother's milk to the robust, often coarse, adult fare. You imagine a Viking infant, nestled close to its mother, relying entirely on breast milk for the initial months, perhaps even years, of its life. This was the primary, and often sole, source of sustenance for the very young. Breastfeeding would continue for an extended period, longer than is common in many modern societies, sometimes for 2 or even 3 years. This prolonged period provided essential antibodies, nutrition, and a crucial bond, especially in an environment where other food sources for infants were scarce and hygiene was a constant challenge. You consider the profound physical toll this would take on a Viking mother, highlighting her central role in the survival of her offspring. As the child grew, the transition to solid foods, or weaning, would have been a gradual process. This wasn't about baby purees or specially formulated cereals. Instead, infants would be introduced to the same basic staples that sustained the adults, albeit in a more digestible form. You picture a small hand reaching for a spoonful of thin, watery gruel, made from finely ground barley or rye. This would be the first step, a gentle introduction to the taste and texture of grains. The gruel might be mixed with a bit of milk or perhaps some broth from a simmering stew to make it more palatable and nutritious. Then, as teeth emerged and the digestive system matured, the child would slowly progress to thicker porridges, perhaps with tiny, mashed bits of dried fish or soft cheese. You observe a child gumming a small piece of softened dried fish, or perhaps a crumb of a very soft flatbread, carefully prepared to prevent choking. Small portions of very well-cooked vegetables, if available from foraging or limited cultivation, might also be introduced. The emphasis was on soft, easily digestible foods that could be prepared using existing ingredients and cooking methods. There would be no special baby food industry. Children ate what the adults ate, just in a modified form. Historians still argue whether certain soft, fermented dairy products like skyr, remember that thick, yogurt-like substance, played a particularly important role in infant and child diets, offering easily digestible protein and probiotics. It's certainly plausible, given its nutritional density and the fact that fermentation can reduce lactose content. You can almost see a mother gently feeding a spoonful of skyr to a squirming toddler, a vital source of energy for their growing bodies. The weaning process was not just about nutrition, It was a cultural rite of passage, a slow immersion into the communal diet and the rhythms of the household. It taught resilience and adaptability from a very young age. You realize that the survival of the next generation depended directly on the ability to transition these small, vulnerable beings from the protective sustenance of mother's milk to the hardy, often bland, but utterly essential foods of the Viking world. It was a testament to the quiet, constant effort involved in sustaining life in a challenging environment. Having considered the careful nurturing of the youngest Vikings, your focus now shifts to the deeper, more symbolic connection between food and belief in the Viking world. Food was not merely sustenance. It played a significant, and often surprisingly practical role in ritual and belief, tying the mundane act of eating to the spiritual fabric of their lives. You step into a different kind of gathering, not a feast, but a solemn occasion. You might witness a small offering being made at a local shrine, perhaps a handful of grain scattered upon a sacred stone, or a small portion of a hunted animal laid out. This wasn't about appeasing vengeful gods with grand sacrifices every day, but about acknowledging the deities and the natural forces that provided their sustenance. It was a plea for good harvests, successful hunts, and fertile livestock. These were quiet acts of reciprocity, a recognition that the earth and its bounties were gifts, not entitlements. Consider the role of food in the famed blot rituals, which were more elaborate communal sacrifices. While animals were indeed sacrificed, the meat was often then cooked and shared among the participants in a communal feast. This wasn't waste, it was a way of sharing the sacred, of bringing the community together, and of establishing a direct connection with the gods through the act of consumption. You imagine the crackling fire, the scent of roasting meat, and the solemn faces of those gathered, participating in a shared meal that transcended mere hunger. This shared meal fostered community bonds and reinforced social hierarchies, as portions might be distributed based on status. Certain foods might have been imbued with symbolic meaning. For instance, bread, as a fundamental staple, could represent life and sustenance itself. You might see specific loaves baked for particular rituals, perhaps etched with symbols or offered to the household spirits, the Vetir, believed to protect the home and its resources. The act of baking and sharing bread was a daily ritual in itself, but it took on added significance during special observances. Then there's the role of ale and mead in these rituals. You recall their importance as everyday beverages, but during ceremonies, their consumption took on a sacred dimension. Imagine horns brimming with mead being passed around, each sip a toast to the gods, ancestors, or specific forces of nature. The mild intoxication would have facilitated a sense of communal euphoria, perhaps even spiritual transport, strengthening the collective belief and social cohesion. This wasn't just about getting tipsy, it was about communion, about breaking down barriers between the mortal and spiritual realms. Historians still argue whether some of the more elaborate food-related rituals were direct appeals for divine intervention or more symbolic acts of community building and social reinforcement. Regardless, food was an integral component, binding the practical need for sustenance to the deeper meaning of life, death, and the forces that governed their world. You realize that for the Vikings, every meal, every harvest, every catch, held a subtle undercurrent of reverence, a quiet acknowledgement of the complex relationship between humanity and the natural world, mediated by their gods and their ancient traditions. Leaving behind the solemn rituals, your thoughts now turn to the tangible impact of the Viking diet on their bodies, examining their dietary health and ailments. While often portrayed as robust and formidable, the realities of their food intake meant a unique set of nutritional challenges and surprising strengths, far removed from modern understandings of balanced nutrition. You consider the sheer physical demands of Viking life: farming, fishing, sailing, fighting. This required immense energy, which their grain-heavy, fat-rich diet certainly provided. The prevalence of animal fats from butter, blubber, and the occasional meat would have been crucial for caloric density, especially in cold climates. You imagine the feeling of warmth spreading through you after a meal rich in these fats, a vital defense against the pervasive chill. proteins from fish and dairy would have supported muscle growth and repair, essential for their physically demanding existence. However, the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables for much of the year presented significant challenges. You picture the long, dark winters, when fresh greens were virtually non-existent. This leads to the most common dietary deficiency of the era, scurvy. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy would manifest as lethargy, bleeding gums, tooth loss, and eventually, death. While some sources of vitamin C existed, such as foraged berries preserved through drying or fermentation, and possibly some organ meats, these were often insufficient to ward off the disease completely during prolonged periods of scarcity. You might notice the pale complexion and swollen joints of someone suffering from the early stages of scurvy, a grim reminder of the dietary limitations. Beyond scurvy, the coarse, unrefined nature of their grain products, while providing fiber, could also lead to dental issues. You imagine the grinding sound of their quern stones, producing flour that contained grit and small stone fragments. This, combined with the toughness of dried and salted foods, would have contributed to tooth wear and dental abscesses. You might wince at the thought of chronic tooth pain, a common ailment without the luxury of modern dentistry. Archaeological evidence frequently reveals significant dental attrition in Viking skeletons. On the positive side, their diet, while limited in variety, was generally free from highly processed sugars and unhealthy fats common in modern diets. This would have meant a lower incidence of diseases associated with modern Western diets, such as heart disease and type 2 diabetes, at least in the forms we understand them today. The active lifestyle, coupled with a diet primarily composed of whole, unprocessed foods, contributed to a lean and strong physique. Historians still argue whether the overall nutritional status of the average Viking was consistently good, if it fluctuated dramatically with seasonal availability and geographical location. It's likely a mix, with periods of robust health interspersed with times of deficiency and hardship. You realize that while their diet might seem bland and restrictive to your modern palate, it was, for the most part, highly effective at fueling a demanding lifestyle in a challenging environment, despite its inherent limitations and the specific ailments it sometimes fostered. From the intimate details of Viking health, your journey now broadens to encompass the silent witnesses that inform our understanding of their diet today, the meticulous work of archaeology, and dietary clues. It's not just ancient texts or sagas that tell us what Vikings ate, it's the painstaking examination of what they left behind, from the microscopic to the macroscopic. You imagine a team of archaeologists, carefully sifting through layers of earth at a dig site, perhaps at a former settlement like Jarlshof in Shetland or Birka in Sweden. They are not just looking for grand artifacts, they are searching for the subtle remnants of everyday life, especially food. You observe them meticulously examining animal bones. Every bone fragment tells a story. Were they from wild animals or domesticated ones? What species were most common? The size and age of the bones can indicate breeding practices or hunting success. Cut marks on the bones reveal how the animals were butchered and prepared, while gnaw marks might suggest scavenging animals or even human teeth. This osteological evidence provides a robust picture of their meat consumption patterns, indicating, for example, a predominance of cattle and sheep in many settlements, alongside evidence of wild game. Next, you watch as they carefully analyze fish bones and scales. These tiny, often overlooked fragments are gold mines of information, revealing the types of fish consumed, their size, and even the season in which they were caught. The sheer quantity of cod bones in some coastal settlements points directly to the importance of dried fish in their diet. You might even see evidence of specialized fishing techniques reflected in the types of fish represented. Then there's the microscopic world. You peer through a magnifying glass as an archaeologist examines soil samples. Within these tiny specks of earth, they can find pollen grains and plant macrofossils, seeds, charred plant remains, even phytoliths, silica structures from plants. These tell us about the grains they cultivated: barley, rye, oats, the wild plants they gathered, berries, nettles, and even what was growing in their immediate environment. The presence of specific pollen from agricultural crops confirms farming activities, while concentrations of wild plant seeds point to foraging practices. This paleo-ethnobotanical evidence paints a picture of their vegetable and fruit intake. Beyond the earth, archaeologists also examine human remains. You observe a skeletal anthropologist carefully studying human teeth. You recall the wear patterns from coarse grains and grit, visible evidence of their diet. Isotopic analysis of bone collagen and tooth enamel provides even more astonishing insights. By analyzing the ratios of stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, scientists can determine the relative proportion of marine versus terrestrial foods in an individual's diet, and even differentiate between plants, C3 versus C4, though mostly C3 in Viking Age Scandinavia, and different animal protein sources. You might see a chart showing that coastal Vikings had a higher marine protein signature than inland ones, a direct scientific confirmation of their dietary differences. Even less obvious clues emerge. You notice the remnants of pottery and cooking vessels. Residue analysis on the inner surfaces of these pots can identify fats, proteins, and plant compounds, revealing what was cooked within them. A dark, charred residue might indicate grain gruel, while fatty deposits could point to meat or fish stews. Historians still argue whether the precise chemical signatures can always differentiate between fermented and unfermented dairy products with absolute certainty, but the overall picture becomes remarkably clear through these combined scientific approaches. This intricate detective work, combining traditional archaeological excavation with cutting-edge scientific analysis, allows us to piece together a surprisingly detailed picture of the Viking diet. It moves beyond the anecdotal accounts of sagas to provide concrete, undeniable evidence of what truly sustained these people, from the humble grains in their porridge to the fish caught from the unforgiving seas. You realize that every tiny fragment, every subtle chemical signature, contributes to our ever-deepening understanding of their daily culinary lives. From the scientific precision of archaeological evidence, your journey through the Viking diet now culminates in a reflection on its enduring legacy. It might seem like a simple, even austere, historical diet, yet its principles and some of its core ingredients have subtly, and sometimes overtly, shaped the culinary landscape of modern Nordic cuisine and even beyond. You walk through a modern Scandinavian supermarket, and suddenly, you see connections everywhere. That thick, creamy skyr in the dairy aisle. It's a direct descendant of the Viking Age fermented milk product, now a popular health food globally. You pick up a package, recognizing its ancient lineage, its nutritional density still valued today. The emphasis on fermented dairy, though perhaps more sophisticated now, has a clear historical root. Then there's the prominence of fish, particularly in Norway and Iceland. You see fresh salmon, cod, and herring, but also smoked and cured varieties. The legacy of stockfish, though perhaps less common as a daily staple, lives on in traditional dishes and specific dried fish products. The expertise in preserving fish through salting and drying, born of Viking necessity, continues in modern processing techniques and culinary traditions. You appreciate the enduring taste of the sea in these northern lands, a testament to centuries of reliance on their marine bounties. The dark, dense rye breads you find in bakeries across Scandinavia are another direct link. While certainly more refined than their ancient counterparts, the fundamental grain and its characteristic tangy flavor remain a cultural hallmark. You imagine slicing a piece of rich, dark rye bread, and you can almost taste the echoes of a Viking breakfast, centuries removed. The simplicity and heartiness of grain-based foods have never truly left the Nordic table. Even the appreciation for foraged foods and wild berries persists. In the summer, you still find markets overflowing with wild blueberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries, often used in desserts, jams, and traditional dishes. This quiet connection to the land's natural bounty, once a matter of survival, is now a beloved cultural practice, a celebration of regional flavors. You might even find chefs experimenting with wild herbs and plants, reflecting a renewed interest in their ancestral diet. And of course, ale and mead have seen a resurgence. Craft breweries across Scandinavia and beyond are now producing a vast array of ales, many drawing inspiration from historical brewing methods. Mead, once a drink of kings and sagas, is experiencing a global revival, appreciated for its unique honeyed complexity. You might clink a glass of modern mead, recognizing that you're participating in a tradition that spans over 1,000 years. Historians still argue whether the perceived healthiness of modern Nordic diets is directly attributable to these ancient Viking principles, or if it's a more complex interplay of environmental factors and modern dietary science. However, the influence is undeniable. The pragmatic approach to food, the emphasis on local ingredients, preservation, and a certain robust simplicity, echoes through the modern cuisine of these regions. You realize that the seemingly bland, practical diet of the Vikings wasn't just about surviving their era, it laid foundational stones for culinary traditions that continue to evolve and thrive today. It's a quiet testament to their resourcefulness, their adaptability, and their deep connection to the land and sea that sustained them. As you reflect on this enduring legacy, you understand that even the most basic elements of human sustenance can carry a story that transcends time, continuing to nourish and inspire us centuries later. The distant crackle of the longhouse fire begins to soften now, the smoke thinning into the twilight. You feel the gentle rhythm of the waves lapping against a distant shore, a peaceful, repetitive sound. The scent of hearth smoke, of drying fish, of freshly churned butter, slowly fades into a quiet hum. Your mind drifts from the bustling market, from the arduous hunts, from the meticulous preservation, to a place of stillness. Imagine the gentle sigh of the wind across vast, empty landscapes, carrying with it the whispers of ancient lives, of simple meals, of quiet endurance. The world of the Vikings, with its practical flavors and its deep reliance on the earth and sea, now settles into the realm of memory. You are safe, warm, and the echoes of their humble feasts are fading into a gentle quiet. Allow your thoughts to become soft, to unfurl like a sail catching a very light breeze, carrying you towards a place of deep rest. The sagas of their diet, with its grains and its fish and its preserved provisions, have done their work. Let the echoes of their existence gently lull you now into a peaceful, dreamless slumber.